Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion on schizophrenia and affective disorders. This time we're talking about the physiology of schizophrenia. Let's start off by talking a little bit about the dopamine hypothesis. This comes from pharmacological evidence that suggests that positive symptoms, that is, the symptoms that are added to the human experience, are caused by overactivity of dopaminergic synapses. We know this because we know that drugs that block dopamine receptors alleviate positive symptoms of schizophrenia, so they help with that. On the other side of that, dopamine agonists increase the incidence and severity of positive symptoms. So taking something like amphetamine would make the positive symptoms of psychology worse. Things like hallucinations and delusions would become aggravated in patients with schizophrenia when they take a dopamine agonist like amphetamine, whereas earlier classes of antipsychotic drugs could alleviate these symptoms by serving as dopaminergic antagonists. It's also theorized that the mesolimbic dopamine pathway is implicated in schizophrenia. This pathway is, of course, involved in our reward system, which plays a key role in the reinforcement of behavior, which we've talked about at some length already in the course. The thought here being that rewarding of sporadic behaviors leads to an increase in their prevalence. So perhaps some of the things we see in schizophrenia are the result of an overactive or dysregulated reward pathway. In addition, some of the disordered activity that we observe may be caused by disorganized attentional processes, also implicated with dopamine signaling. So all of this indiscriminate and unorderly activity of the dopamine system, specifically with synapses in our reward pathways like the nucleus accumbens, make it difficult for these patients to follow orderly thought sequences. And perhaps also increased activity in the amygdala could lead to these paranoid delusions. So this all kind of tracks, right? All of these different areas that could potentially be receiving increased dopamine signaling are implicated with all of the symptomology, or a lot of the symptomology that we see, especially with positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So that part fits. So we also see that amphetamine use by schizophrenic patients will result in greater dopamine release compared to controls. So here we have dopamine release charted as a percent of baseline in control patients and patients with schizophrenia. You see here that for many patients with schizophrenia, they show much greater dopamine release in response to amphetamine use. Of course, as mentioned earlier, amphetamine use also leads to the increased presence of positive symptoms. Some evidence also suggests that there's an increase in dopamine D2 receptors in schizophrenic patients, though it's unlikely that this increases enough to be the primary cause. We'll talk about some other hypotheses as to what could be playing a role in this disorder. So as I mentioned earlier, on the bottom portion of this graph, here we have charted dopamine release, percent of baseline, same as up here. But along the bottom, we have change in positive symptoms. You can see there's a positive correlation between that potentiated dopamine release and the increase in positive symptomology. So speaking further to the role of D2 receptors in schizophrenia, your book talks about a study in which a viral vector, that's a method we talked about back in our methods unit. If you forget how viral vectors work, you can always go revisit that. So a viral vector, which is going to be used to overexpress dopamine D2 receptors, is infused here into the striatum of mice. And this causes increased expression of dopamine D2 receptors. So we crank up the amount of D2 receptors that are present in an ordinary mouse striatum. What this does is cause a decrease in GABAergic transmission within the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I mean, we're skipping a couple of steps in terms of exactly how that is accomplished, but don't worry so much about that. Just know that the end result of increasing D2 receptor expression in the striatum causes dysregulated neural activity within the prefrontal cortex. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is really, really important for things like planning and decision-making, really important higher order cognition stuff, right? So all of these D2 receptors are going to throw off the balance in our prefrontal cortex, causing that abnormal neural activity. And that's going to produce behavioral abnormalities that are characteristic of schizophrenia. So basically, this model of increasing dopamine D2 receptors in the striatum of mice is capable of producing schizophrenic-like behavior in those mice, suggesting that the level of D2 receptors is indeed an important piece of this puzzle. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how dopamine relates to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, but what about those negative and cognitive symptoms? That must be caused by something else. So there's the glutamate hypothesis, the idea that schizophrenic patients show hyperfrontality, that is generally reduced activity in the frontal lobe, and reduced glutamate metabolites present in the cerebral spinal fluid. This might better explain negative and cognitive symptoms. We also know that low doses of glutamate antagonists produce negative and cognitive-like symptoms. Things like PCP and ketamine can produce these effects or similar effects in healthy subjects. So initially, dopamine antagonists were commonly used to treat schizophrenia, right? If we have too much dopamine causing those positive symptoms, if we antagonize dopamine signaling, we can reduce those, right? And that's exactly what happened. This improved positive symptoms, but did little or made worse cognitive and negative symptoms. And oftentimes, long-term use could lead to some symptoms resembling those of Parkinson's disease, right? Because of the diminished dopamine signaling. Things like slowness in movement, a lack of facial expression, or general weakness. These things were generally temporary, but still nasty side effects. Later, we had the development of atypical antipsychotics. These treat both the positive and the negative symptoms and produce much fewer neurological side effects. And we'll talk about how exactly atypical antipsychotics work in just a bit. So while positive symptoms are pretty unique to schizophrenia, negative and cognitive symptoms are similar to other neurological disorders. Right? They have a lot in common with things like anxiety or depression. And studies suggest that these may be caused by abnormalities within the prefrontal cortex. There are real morphological differences present in schizophrenia versus healthy individuals. So here we have an MRI of a well twin, someone who does not express schizophrenia, and one who does show schizophrenia. There's evidence of loss of brain tissue within schizophrenic patients, particularly visible around the lateral ventricles, which are significantly larger in schizophrenic patients compared to their cohort. There's also a loss of cerebral gray matter in schizophrenic patients. So there's less gray matter, and we see that sort of made up for with larger ventricles. So those ventricles being the cerebral spinal fluid spaces within the brain. So one way of thinking about schizophrenia is with this positive and negative symptom relationship is how dopamine may play differently in different regions. So there's some evidence that a decrease in dopaminergic activity in the prefrontal cortex, which we might call hypofrontality, leads to those negative and cognitive symptoms, whereas increased dopamine activity in the mesolimbic system contributes more to the positive symptoms. So in particular, with regard to this hypofrontality, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seems to be very important. We see here decreased activity in schizophrenic patients in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex compared to normal healthy subjects. Patients with schizophrenia often do poorly on tests sensitive to prefrontal damage. Things like tests of executive function, planning, perspective taking, this sort of thing. So you might wonder, how do we treat such a complex disorder, right? We have dopamine that's too high in some regions and dopamine that is too low in other regions. So an agonist or an antagonist is going to imbalance things in one direction or the other. Well, the solution is the sort of newest wave of treatment for schizophrenia is atypical antipsychotics. They do a decent job of alleviating symptoms that are positive, negative, and cognitive. They do this by increasing dopamine signaling in the prefrontal cortex, but decreasing it in the mesolimbic system. So how does this work? Well, let's take the example of aripiprazole, or Abilify, which is a partial agonist. It has a high affinity for a particular receptor type, but it activates the receptor less than a normal ligand would. So it's a partial agonist because it activates the receptor partially, right? So it serves as an agonist in regions of low ligand concentration, right? Because imagine if you have an area with not much dopamine signaling, if you bring in a drug that activates everything halfway, it's going to bind all those receptors with high affinity and cause a moderate level of activation. So it's going to increase the amount of dopamine signaling there. But if you have a region with a large amount of dopamine signaling taking place, perhaps too much, if you put this drug in that competes really well, it's going to bind all those neurotransmitter receptor sites and produce moderate activation. Thus, it's going to lower the level of activation, right? Because it's going to outcompete dopamine and lower the level of activation. So let's look at this in terms of pictures. So dopamine receptors aren't ion channels, but let's just look at this example of a partial agonist that's going to be working on something that contains an ion channel, right? Just as a way of abstracting the idea. So here we have an area of high neurotransmitter concentration. So the neurotransmitters are pictured in black, and in red we have our partial agonist. So if it causes every channel open to an arbitrary value of 1, so a full opening, the mean opening of receptors in this region is going to be 1. However, if we put in this partial agonist, which is only going to produce a partial opening, it's going to lower the mean opening, right? So here we only have 1 endogenous neurotransmitter binding, and we have 4 of these partial agonists binding. Each of the partial agonist bindings is going to produce a reduced activation. So our mean opening, our mean activation is going to be lowered to 0.6. So that way we take high activity and decrease it. Down here, we have an area with almost no dopamine signaling happening, right? Our neurotransmitter is very, very sparse. So we throw in a bunch of this partial agonist. It's going to bind all of these receptors and produce moderate activation, right? So the mean opening goes from 0.2 up to 0.5, right? Because we have one receptor being activated fully here, and now we have all the receptors being activated partially. So in this way, a partial agonist can sort of normalize activity, right? It brings activity up in regions that are very underactive and brings activity down in regions that are overactive. Okay, that's it for our brief discussion on schizophrenia. Next time we're talking about affective